History remembers the loud ones, the conquerors, the big speeches, the armies marching in with flags raised high. It almost never remembers the quiet ones, people with no flag, no parade, no name you would recognize, just ordinary people who decided every morning not to let the day push them around before they had a say in it. These people have lived in every generation. The soldier who trained before there was a war. The worker who showed up early on days nobody was watching. The person who protected their first hour, even when they could not explain why it mattered so much to them. Nobody wrote songs about them. Nobody put up statues for the person who simply did not check their phone for 30 extra minutes. But ask anyone who built something real, a strong body, a real skill, work that took years, a character that held up when life got hard, and they will tell you the same thing. It started in the morning, long before anyone noticed, long before there was anything to show for it. This morning you get to join that quiet group. No uniform, no flag, just 5 simple ideas that have lasted longer than empires, because they never needed perfect conditions to work. They worked for a man who had everything. They worked for a man who had nothing, not even his own body. They will work for you too, no matter what kind of morning you are having right now. This is not a list of tricks you forget by lunch. It is a way of meeting the day that, if you keep doing it, slowly becomes part of who you are. 5 simple ideas. 1 ordinary morning. The start of something quiet that nobody else will see, happening before sunrise, inside 1 hour that belongs only to you. Type this in the comments right now and claim it as yours. I claim this hour. Principle 1. Build before you're tested. The old Stoics did not build their strength during the storm. They built it on the calm days, the boring days, the days when nothing was asking anything of them. Most people get this backward. They wait for the hard day to show up and only then try to find some discipline inside themselves, right when their fear is loudest and their thinking is at its worst. By then, it is too late to build anything. You can only spend what you already saved up. Marcus Aurelius did not stay calm under pressure because pressure taught him to be calm. He stayed calm because he had quietly practiced staying calm for years. On ordinary mornings nobody was watching, when nothing was actually on the line. That is the part most people skip. They want the calm mind without ever doing the small, boring work that builds it. They want the result without putting in the practice. Seneca called this kind of preparation getting ready before you need to be ready, not nervous waiting, always bracing for something bad. Quiet readiness, the same way you would store water before a drought, not because the drought is happening yet, but because one day it will, and you cannot fill a well once it is already dry. This is the part that tells you real strength, apart from the look of strength. A lot of people seem calm on easy days simply because easy days never ask anything of their calm. The real test only shows up once life stops cooperating. So this morning, do not wait for a hard day to find out what you are made of. Do something small and a little difficult right now, while the cost is low and nothing forces your hand. Hold a position a bit longer than feels comfortable. Sit with a question you keep avoiding. Pick the harder of 2 small options, just to prove to yourself that you still can. None of this matters because of what it gets you today. It matters because of what it saves for later. Every bit of discipline you practice on an easy morning becomes something you can pull from later, on a morning that is not easy at all. You are not building today's strength today. You are building the strength you will need next month, next year, on a day you cannot see yet. That is the real reason an ordinary, nothing special morning like this one matters. Not to feel busy or productive. To quietly put something aside that you will need to draw on later, on a day you never planned for and cannot predict. Think about people you know who seem to handle real crisis without falling apart. Watch them closely over time and you will almost always find the same thing underneath. Years of small, unglamorous practice on ordinary days that nobody else noticed. They were not born steady. They simply saved up steadiness for a long time before they ever needed to spend it. You are saving some of that right now just by sitting with this idea instead of skipping past it. That counts. Even though it feels small, it counts. If you are building reserves today instead of spending them, drop it below. I build before I need it. Principle 2. Speak less, decide more. You probably know someone who announces every plan before they have done any of the actual work. They tell you about the business they are starting, the habit they are building, the new person they are becoming. The telling itself seems to satisfy something in them. And then, often, nothing else follows. The Stoics were suspicious of this. Not because talking is bad, because talking about something can quietly take the place of doing it. Your mind gets a small reward just from saying the plan out loud, and that little reward can be just enough to take away the push you needed to actually start. Epictetus warned his students about exactly this. He told them that sheep do not throw up the grass they ate just to show the shepherd how much they ate. They quietly turn it into wool and milk, and that is the only proof anyone needs. He wanted his students to do the same with what they learned. Stop talking about it constantly, and instead let their lives look different because of it. This morning, notice how much of your day usually goes into talking about your plans instead of doing them. The idea you described to a friend over coffee. The goal you announced to anyone who would listen. All that talking about what you are about to do, like the talking itself was a kind of doing. It is not. Most of the time it does the opposite. It drains away the urgency that staying quiet would have kept alive. Try something different today. Pick one thing you would normally tell people about and just go do it instead. Do not tell anyone you are starting. Do not post about it. Do not even mention it to the people closest to you, not until it is already in motion. Let your action be the only thing you say. There is a quiet kind of confidence that comes from this, knowing you are doing something simply because it needs doing, without needing anyone to watch you begin. Speak less. Decide more. Let the results, eventually, be the only announcement that matters. There is a strange relief in this once you actually try it. Without an audience already expecting something from you, you are free to fail quietly, change your mind quietly, shift direction without explaining yourself to anyone. The work feels lighter, not heavier, once it stops being a performance for people who were never going to help you finish it anyway. Most announcements are not really for the person listening. They are a way of borrowing motivation from an imagined audience. Motivation that is never actually there at 6 in the morning, alone, when the real work needs to get done. If you are doing instead of announcing today, you already know it. My actions speak first. Principle 3. Make your standards private. Discipline you only show off for other people is weak in one specific way. It only lasts as long as someone is watching. The second nobody is paying attention, the motivation that depended on being seen quietly fades, and so does the behavior that came with it. That is why so many people keep a habit perfectly while others are watching and then drop it the moment they are alone. It was never really their own standard. It was a performance set to whoever happened to be in the room that day. The old Stoics built something sturdier than performance. They built private standards, promises kept simply because nobody else would ever know whether they were kept or broken. Marcus Aurelius wrote his private notes with no plan to publish them. Nobody was supposed to read them. They survived by accident hundreds of years later. He was not writing for history. He was writing to hold himself to a standard that was true whether or not anyone ever saw it. This morning, think honestly about which of your habits are real and which ones are just a show. The workout you only do when someone might see it on a screen. The kindness you only show when it might get noticed. The calm you only hold when an audience happens to be there to see it. None of that makes you fake, but it is not fully yours yet. Part of it still belongs to whoever was watching when you decided to do it. Pick one standard today and keep it completely to yourself. Tell nobody. Let nobody see it. Do it simply because you decided it matters, knowing full well that nobody will ever find out whether you kept it or quietly let it go. Keeping something private like that is where real character actually lives. Not in what you do when people might clap for you, in what you do when no clapping is ever coming. This feels uncomfortable to practice at first, especially in a world that hands out attention for anything you post about. There is a real pull to share the workout, mention the early wake-up, let people know what you are doing. Resisting that pull does not mean the discipline disappears. It means the discipline finally belongs entirely to you, instead of being shared with whoever happens to be watching. The strongest people you will ever meet are usually the quietest about what they actually do each morning. Not because they are hiding something shameful, because they figured out a long time ago that the moment a standard turns into a performance, it stops being fully theirs. What is one standard you could keep today with absolutely nobody watching? Share it, but only after you have already done it privately. This one, stay out of the comments. Keep it between you and yourself. Principle 4. Refuse the easy yes. Every morning hands you a string of tiny, almost invisible choices. The snooze button instead of the alarm. The phone instead of silence. One more easy comfort instead of one small act of discipline. Each one feels small on its own. None of them feel like a real decision in the moment. But the Stoics knew that character is never built in the big dramatic moments people imagine. It is built entirely in these small choices, repeated so many times that they slowly turn into who you are. Every easy yes to comfort is a small vote for becoming someone who chooses comfort. Every time you say no to that easy comfort, you vote for becoming someone else. Epictetus practiced a specific kind of resistance, not against things that were actually harmful, but against comfort itself, simply because it was comfortable, just to prove that comfort did not yet control him. He believed a person should sometimes pick the harder option for no reason, except to check that they still could. This morning, notice the easy yeses arriving one after another. The extra 5 minutes in bed. The notification that promises a quick distraction. The version of the morning that asks nothing at all of you. Say no to one of them, not because the easy choice is dangerous, because turning it down on purpose, for no practical reason except the refusal itself, reminds you who is actually in charge here. This is not about punishing yourself or treating comfort like an enemy. Comfort is not the enemy. Comfort is your default, the thing you reach for automatically without ever choosing otherwise. That is what slowly weakens a person's ability to do hard things when hard things eventually show up and cannot be avoided. Refuse one easy yes today. That is enough to start. The habit grows from there. There is a reason this practice feels harder than it should. Comfort rarely shows up looking like a threat. It shows up looking completely reasonable. Just 5 more minutes. Just one quick look at the phone. Just this once, since today already feels tiring. Every excuse sounds perfectly fair in the moment it is offered. The Stoics were not fooled by that disguise. Practicing this refusal is partly about training yourself to spot it for what it really is. Not a fair exception. A small vote, dressed up as logic, for becoming someone who makes an exception every time comfort asks nicely enough. If you refused an easy yes this morning, say so below. I refuse comfort on purpose. Principle 5. Finish what today demands, not what feels good. The Stoics had a strong sense of duty that had little to do with feeling inspired. They believed every person played a role, as a parent, a worker, a friend, a neighbor, and that role came with things you had to do whether or not you felt like doing them that morning. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself about getting out of bed on mornings he did not want to, not with some big speech about greatness, just a simple reminder that he was a human being, and being human meant doing what was needed of a human, no matter how he happened to feel that day. Most people wait until they feel ready before they act. The Stoics flipped that order completely. They acted because the role required it, and the feeling of being ready, if it ever came, showed up afterward as a result of acting, not as something you needed before you could start. This morning, do not ask yourself what you feel like doing. Ask what today actually needs from you, no matter your mood. The task that has to get finished whether you are inspired or not. The responsibility that does not check how you feel before it shows up at your door. Go do that thing. Not because it will feel good, because it is what the day and the role you are playing in it genuinely requires. This is the piece that holds everything else together. Building reserves before you need them. Talking less and deciding more. Keeping your standards to yourself. Saying no to easy comfort. And finally, doing what today actually needs, instead of waiting for a feeling that might never show up on its own. None of this requires you to feel inspired. It only requires the decision to act like the role you are playing actually matters, starting with this very ordinary morning. There is real freedom in this once you try it. When duty replaces mood as the thing that moves you, you stop being controlled by however you happen to feel on a given day. Good mood or bad mood, tired or full of energy, the work that needs doing still gets done because it was never really tied to your mood in the first place. That kind of steady consistency, more than any single burst of motivation, is what eventually builds a life that looks disciplined from the outside. Not because the person felt inspired every morning, because they showed up either way. If you are choosing duty over mood today, claim it in the comments. I do what today requires. Why the first hour matters so much. Let us talk about why the Stoics cared so much about this 1 hour out of the 24 the day actually gives you. It comes down to momentum. Once a direction is set, it tends to keep going. A day that starts off reactive, checking your phone, taking in bad news, letting someone else's panic become your own, tends to stay reactive. The pattern set in the first 60 minutes becomes the way you handle everything else, unless something steps in to break it. This is simple, not mystical. Your mind takes its cue from whatever happens first. If the first thing that hits you is calm and chosen by you, you settle into calm. If the first thing is urgent and forced on you from outside, you settle into urgency, and that urgency leaks into everything else, even things that had nothing to do with what started it. This is why one bad notification at 6 in the morning can somehow change how you handle a totally unrelated conversation at 2 in the afternoon. Your nervous system does not file things away neatly into separate folders. It carries the tone with you, often without you ever noticing it happened. The Stoics noticed this pattern thousands of years before anyone had words like nervous system or psychological priming. They simply saw that how a person began their day shaped everything that came after, and they built their whole practice around protecting that beginning. That is also why these 5 ideas are placed in this order. Building reserves first sets the foundation underneath everything else. Talking less and deciding more saves the energy that talk usually drains away. Keeping standards private makes your discipline strong enough to survive when nobody is watching. Saying no to easy comfort builds the muscle that resists comfort by default. And finishing what the day actually needs, instead of waiting for motivation, ties the whole thing together into one piece, instead of 5 separate habits with no connection between them. None of these 5 works at full strength on their own. Someone who builds reserves but tells everyone every plan out loud leaks away the very energy those reserves were supposed to store. Someone who keeps perfect private standards but always waits to feel motivated before acting still loses entire mornings to nothing. The 5 work together as one system, each one holding up the others. This is why the 1% who win their first hour over and over again are not simply lucky or born with more discipline. They built a full system, often without ever explaining it this way, instead of leaning on one single habit to carry the whole weight. Picture how this plays out in real life. Someone builds reserves carefully, but talks about every plan before they even start it, and loses momentum before the work begins. Someone keeps perfect private standards, but always gives in to the easy comfort the moment nobody is checking, and still ends up scattered by the middle of the day because comfort quietly won the votes that mattered most. Each piece covers for what the others cannot fully handle alone. The Stoics thought about character the same way. They rarely talked about a single trait by itself. Courage without good judgment turns into recklessness. Discipline without kindness turns into harshness. These 5 morning ideas work the same way, only powerful together, balancing and supporting each other. You now have that same full system. The only question left is not whether you understand it. It is whether you will actually practice it tomorrow morning when the alarm goes off and the old pull toward your phone feels exactly as strong as it always has. The Slave and the Emperor. There is something striking about Stoic philosophy that gets lost when people reduce it to productivity tips. The 2 most well-known Stoic voices we still study lived in completely opposite circumstances. Marcus Aurelius was the most powerful man on earth, commanding armies, ruling an empire that stretched across 3 continents. Epictetus was born into slavery, hurt badly by a cruel master, and spent years with no control over his own body, let alone his own schedule. And yet both of them landed on almost the exact same answers about how to start a day, how to face hard things, how to build a mind that does not break under pressure. That should tell you something important. The ideas we have walked through this morning were never luxuries only available to people with money, free time, or easy circumstances. Epictetus built his whole philosophy of discipline while owning nothing, controlling nothing about his outside life, facing daily cruelty most people today will never come close to experiencing. If a man with no control over his own body could still control his first thought each morning, could still build whatever discipline was available inside his circumstances, could still think through how he wanted to respond to cruelty before it ever arrived, then the excuse that your life is too busy, too hard, too demanding for this practice does not really hold up. This is not about ignoring real difficulty. Some mornings genuinely are harder than others. Sickness, grief, exhaustion, and circumstances entirely outside your control can make even the smallest discipline feel impossible some days. The Stoics never asked for perfect execution no matter what. They were pointing at something simpler, that even in the hardest circumstances, some small piece of control over your own mind is still available, and that piece is worth protecting fiercely because it is the one thing nobody can ever take from you. Epictetus said this more plainly than almost anyone before or since. He said we are not bothered by what happens to us, but by our own opinion about what happens to us. His body was never his to control. His mind, he insisted, still was. He built his whole way of thinking around protecting that one freedom that remained. This connects straight back to the idea of private standards from earlier. Epictetus had no audience who could take his discipline away from him, because that discipline never depended on anyone watching it. It lived entirely inside him, somewhere his circumstances could never reach. That is exactly the kind of discipline this whole morning has been pointing you toward. The kind nobody can take from you, because nobody gave it to you in the first place. Marcus Aurelius, even with every comfort and resource available to him, chose to live by that same rule. Not because he had to, because he understood that comfort and power do not automatically build discipline on their own. If anything, they tend to wear it down unless someone actively works against that. That is why he woke before sunrise. Why he wrote his private notes constantly, holding himself to standards nobody else was forcing on him. Why he trained his body, thought ahead about hard moments, and protected his own mind from the soft, corrupting pull of unlimited power and unlimited comfort. Between the slave and the emperor, neither situation is an excuse and neither one is a guarantee either. The discipline has to be chosen on purpose, no matter what life has handed you. That choice is available to you this morning, exactly the way it was available to both of them, in their very different lives, 2,000 years ago. There is a third person worth mentioning here, someone who sat between these two extremes. Seneca was wealthy, well-connected, an advisor to emperors, and yet he wrote some of the sharpest warnings about wealth and comfort that survived from that whole era. He understood, maybe better than anyone, how comfort can quietly soften a person without them ever noticing, and how the absence of difficulty can become its own kind of danger. Seneca's letters to his friend Lucilius are full of reminders to practice hard things on purpose, exactly because his own life offered so little real hardship by default. He understood that without deliberate practice, comfort slowly weakens you, the same way a muscle weakens simply from never being used, even while the rest of the body stays healthy. This matters no matter what your life looks like right now. If things are genuinely hard for you right now, Epictetus speaks directly to you. Your mind is still yours to command even when little else is. If your life is comfortable and stable, free from major hardship, Seneca speaks directly to you. Comfort is nothing to apologize for, but it needs to be balanced on purpose, or it will quietly weaken the very discipline you are trying to build. Most people live somewhere between these two extremes, facing some real difficulty alongside genuine comfort. The full range of Stoic teaching pulled from all three of these men speaks to that mixed reality better than any one of them could alone. The 99 and the 1. Right now, the 99 are reaching for their phones. They are letting a notification decide their mood. A headline decides their mindset. A stranger's opinion decides what fills their thoughts for the next few hours. They are not bad people. They are not weak people. They simply never learned that the first hour can be won, or that winning it takes nothing more than 5 deliberate choices made before the world gets a vote. You now know what they do not. You know strength can be saved up quietly before it is ever needed, the same way you would store water before a drought. That talking about your plans can quietly take the place of actually doing them, and that staying quiet often serves you better than narrating everything. That discipline kept private holds up better than discipline performed for an audience. That every small comfort you turn down on purpose is a vote for who you are becoming. And that duty, not mood, is what actually carries a person through an ordinary morning into a life that holds up under real pressure. None of this asks for anything you do not already have. No special gear, no perfect circumstances, no years of training before you are allowed to start. It only asks for the decision to start tomorrow morning the same way you started this one, on purpose, before the world shows up with its own plans for you. The 1% was not handed more willpower than everyone else. They simply decided on one ordinary morning a long time ago that the first hour belonged to them. And then they kept deciding that, morning after morning, until it stopped being a decision at all and just became who they were. That same identity is available to you starting tomorrow. Not because tomorrow is special, because every morning offers the exact same chance, fresh, no matter how many times you missed it before. Today, you already walked through 5 ideas the 1% live by. Tomorrow, you get to practice them again, and the day after that, until the practice simply becomes permanent. This is not about becoming someone completely new overnight. It is about slowly and deliberately becoming the kind of person who does not need the day to be special in order to show up fully for it. Carry these 5 ideas into the rest of today. And when tomorrow's light comes, remember you have a choice the second your eyes open. Before the phone, before the noise, before anyone else gets a say. Choose to be the one. One more thing before you go. You might be tempted to treat everything we covered today as something interesting to think about, instead of something to actually practice tomorrow. That temptation is completely normal. Most people who hear ideas like this nod along, agree it sounds reasonable, and then go right back to their same old morning, simply because the old pattern is familiar and the new one takes real effort in those first uncomfortable days. The Stoics had a name for the space between knowing something is true and actually living like it is true. They considered that space the whole battlefield of philosophy. Anyone can read Epictetus and nod along with his ideas about controlling your own thoughts. Far fewer people actually practice it the next time someone cuts them off in traffic or says something unkind. These 5 ideas mean nothing if they stay ideas you simply found interesting. They only become real the moment you wake up tomorrow and actually pause before grabbing your phone. The moment you actually choose 10 minutes of something hard instead of 10 more minutes under the blanket. The moment you actually spend 2 minutes thinking through how you want to handle today's likely problems instead of leaving it up to chance. That is the part most people skip. It is also the only part that actually matters. So here is a direct challenge, not a gentle suggestion. Tomorrow morning, pick just one of these 5 ideas and actually live it fully for that one morning. Do not try to master all 5 at once. Pick the one that felt hardest to hear today. That usually means it is the one you need most, and let the rest build from there. Small, steady practice beats the occasional perfect day every single time. The Stoics were never interested in one big dramatic show of discipline. They cared about steady, repeated practice that slowly became identity. You do not need to become the 1% overnight. You need to take one step toward it tomorrow morning and then another step the morning after that. Picture where you will be in a year if you actually practice this. Not perfectly, just consistently, knowing some mornings will get missed and some days will not go as planned, because that is simply part of building any real discipline. A year of mostly winning your first hour compared to a year of mostly losing it to whatever notification shows up first. Those are 2 completely different lives, even though the difference on any single morning feels small. That is how real change actually happens. Not through one big dramatic moment, but through small decisions quietly stacking up, repeated so many times that they eventually become impossible to separate from who you simply are. Marcus Aurelius did not become the steady, disciplined leader history remembers because of one extraordinary morning. He became that person through thousands of ordinary mornings, most of which nobody else ever saw, most of which were completely unremarkable, all of which stacked on top of each other until the discipline simply became who he was, no longer something he had to force himself into every single day. That same thing is available to you. Not as some far-off possibility for people with more time or more natural discipline than you. Available starting with the very next morning you wake up, no matter how many mornings before this one got lost to the same old pattern. The 99 will keep reaching for their phones first. They will keep letting the outside world decide their mood and their focus and their whole approach to the day, simply because nobody ever showed them there was another option. Or because they saw the option and decided it asked for too much effort to actually try. You now know there is another option. You know exactly what it asks of you. 5 ideas, open to anyone willing to practice them, no matter their circumstances, no matter how busy or hard their life feels right now. The choice in front of you tomorrow morning is the same choice that has stood in front of every person, in every time period, since people first started asking how a life should be lived. Will you let the day happen to you, or will you decide in the first 60 seconds exactly who is about to walk through it? That decision does not ask for anything you do not already have. It only asks for your willingness to make it tomorrow morning before the world gets there first. Carry these 5 ideas into the rest of today, even if today already started the old way and the first hour is already gone. There is always a next morning. There is always another first hour waiting for you to claim it. And if today's first hour really is already gone, spent the old way, reacting to whatever showed up first, that is not something worth beating yourself up over. It is just information. Now you know what happened, and tomorrow gives you the exact same chance to choose differently. The Stoics were remarkably forgiving of past slip-ups, mainly because dwelling on them changes absolutely nothing about tomorrow's choices. What matters is not how many mornings you have already lost. What matters is the next one. Some of you will try this tomorrow and feel an immediate difference. Others will try it and feel almost nothing different at first, because real change like this rarely shows up loudly in a single day. If that is you, do not mistake the lack of a dramatic feeling for a lack of progress. The change happens quietly, underneath what you can consciously feel. The same way one single rep at the gym does not visibly change your body, but adds up to a change you cannot deny after enough repetition. Trust it even when it does not feel dramatic, especially when it does not feel dramatic. That is usually a sign it is working exactly the way it should. One last thing before you go. The reason any of this gets passed down at all is the same reason Marcus Aurelius wrote his private notes, the same reason Epictetus taught his students, the same reason Seneca kept writing letter after letter to his friend. Ideas about discipline only spread because someone, somewhere, decided to write them down or say them out loud for someone else to hear. If something in these 5 ideas actually meant something to you this morning, think about passing it along. Not because sharing things matters in some abstract way, but because the person you share it with might be standing exactly where you stood before you heard this, stuck in the same pattern of letting the world claim the first hour simply because nobody ever showed them there was another way to do it. That is how this kind of knowledge has always traveled, long before video existed, long before written philosophy existed. One person learns something that changes how they move through their days, and they hand it to someone else, who hands it to someone else again. That chain has been running for over 2,000 years. You are simply the newest link in it. Tomorrow morning, before your feet touch the floor, before the phone lights up, before the world gets its vote, remember you have a choice the 99 forgot they even had. Build reserves before you need them. Speak less and decide more. Keep your standards to yourself. Refuse the easy yes. And finish what today actually demands instead of waiting for a feeling that might never show up on its own. This is not a finish line. There is no point where you arrive at being the 1% and stop needing to practice. The practice is the whole thing. Tomorrow, you begin again, the same way everyone who has ever built real discipline began again every single morning for as long as they lived. That is not a burden. That is the entire gift hidden inside it. You get another first hour tomorrow, and another the day after that. Every single morning hands you a fresh chance to claim what the 99 give away without a second thought. Most people will hear this, agree with it, and forget about it by tomorrow afternoon. A small number will actually try it once and quit after a few days when it does not feel life-changing yet. An even smaller number will keep practicing through the quiet, unremarkable early weeks when nothing dramatic seems to be happening, simply because they trust the process enough to keep going without needing proof every single morning. That smaller number is the 1%. Not because they started out with more discipline than everyone else, because they kept showing up for ordinary mornings long enough for the practice to become permanent. Notice something about all 5 ideas you just walked through. None of them required talent. None of them required money or resources you do not already have. Building a reserve only asks for the willingness to do something small and hard before life demands it of you. Speaking less only asks for restraint. Keeping your standards private only asks for the discipline to resist an audience that was never going to help you anyway. Refusing the easy yes only asks for one small moment of friction against your own comfort. And finishing what duty demands only asks for showing up, no matter your mood, Every single one of these is available to you no matter your circumstances, your schedule, your resources, or how you happen to feel on this particular morning. That availability is the whole point. This kind of discipline was never meant to be reserved only for people with special advantages. It was always meant to be open to anyone willing to actually practice it. You now have everything you need to become one of them. Not someday. Starting with tomorrow's first hour, go claim it. And if you got something real out of walking through these 5 ideas this morning, think of this as an invitation to come back tomorrow and practice them again, and the morning after that, until claiming the first hour stops feeling like effort and simply becomes the way you live your life. That is the whole journey from the 99 to the 1, not one single leap. 1,000 ordinary mornings, each one slightly more deliberate than the one before it, until being deliberate is no longer something you have to remind yourself to do. It simply becomes who you are. Go win your first hour. The rest of the day and the rest of your life will follow from there. One last thought before you go. Out of these 5 ideas, you probably felt resistance to at least one of them while you were listening. Maybe keeping your discipline completely private felt strange, since sharing it has always felt motivating to you. Maybe turning down comfort on purpose, with no immediate practical reason, seemed unnecessary. Pay attention to that resistance instead of brushing it off. The idea that gives you the most resistance is usually the exact one your habits need most. Comfort does not push back against what it has already won. It pushes back hardest against the one thing that would actually change something. Start there tomorrow, not with the easiest idea to accept, but with the one that made you the most uncomfortable to hear. That discomfort is not a sign to avoid it. It is a sign you found exactly where to begin. Marcus Aurelius did not write his private notes because he had already mastered everything he wrote about. He wrote them because he was still working on it, still falling short some mornings, still reminding himself of things he already knew but had not yet fully lived. The writing itself was the practice. It was never proof that the practice was finished. You are in that exact same spot this morning. Knowing these 5 ideas does not mean you have already mastered them. It means you now have a clear place to start, the same place men like Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus kept returning to, again and again, for their entire lives, without ever calling themselves finished. That is not discouraging. That is simply what the practice actually looks like, for everyone who has ever taken it seriously. A lifetime of coming back to it, not one single morning of arriving. Come back tomorrow morning. Pick the idea that gave you the most resistance. Practice it imperfectly. Then come back again the morning after that. And keep coming back for as long as it takes. That coming back, more than any one perfect morning ever could, is what slowly builds the unbreakable mind this whole practice was always pointing you toward.